In Albania, there's a centuries-old cultural concept known as besa. It means basically the keeping of a promise, to act honorably, and it holds, or should hold, the highest authority over a person. Beginning in 1945, Albania existed under a communist regime largely cut off from information flow from the outside world and operating wholly outside of the concepts that would be commonplace in a capitalist system. When Albania emerged from isolation in 1991, systems didn't exist to meet the banking needs of the people. The Bank of Albania had to tighten its lending standards after accumulating some bad loans. This led to informal groups coming together to lend against deposits, which in turn led to companies forming to take deposits and make investments. The participants weren't really banking anymore. They were participating in basically private equity. The table was set. A financial plague was coming, and thanks to cultural norms and information blackout in unregulated institutions, Albanians didn't have any immunity. The first wave of Ponzi schemes to rise in Albania at least seemed to have had good intentions. They weren't merely taking deposits to cover the interest and withdrawals of the victims who at least had the foresight to be early. They took money, invested in things like hotels, energy, factories, and generated some return that way. Ostensibly, this allowed them to cover juicy interest rates to depositors of multiple points per month. Obviously, people love to see their savings grow at that rate more than 50% annualized, so they were depositing everything they could afford. The rates didn't necessarily seem impossible because 1, Albanians believe their countrymen are honorable. 2, they didn't have a ton of context for what rates should be. And 3, they thought they knew where those returns were coming from. The mostly correct theory about the high returns was they didn't come from hotels and all that. They came from the highly profitable business of smuggling goods into neighboring Yugoslavia, which was under UN sanction. So people were getting high returns, Yugoslavia was getting contraband, Albanian interest firms were remaining solvent, everything was going great. But towards the end of 1995, the United Nations lifted the sanctions. The firms suddenly lost their lucrative businesses, all while still promising their depositors high returns. How would they pay them? By offering even higher interest rates in order to gain more depositors. This was a clean pivot to Ponzi. They moved rates up to 8% per month, over 100% annually. They had a problem though. Competition entered the market and it was aggressive. These weren't the gentleman's Ponzi's of single-digit monthly rates of return and at least a facade of a real business. This was a take-no-prisoners competitive capitalist Ponzi. The business model seemed literally to be something close to pick a number that's higher than everyone else's, and that's your interest rate. And it worked, at least in terms of stealing deposit. Rates spiraling out of control seemed to not raise concern with Albanians. Again, they had no immunity, like a boomer clicking on a download link in an email. One woman recounted the fact that an interest rate offer was printed on paper rather than handwritten, and this was enough for her to believe it must be a legitimate business. The high rates served merely as an incentive rather than a warning. Albanians, by the way, is truly the correct term for the victims here. There's no modifier needed in front of that term. This wasn't gullible Albanians or greedy Albanians. It was Albanians as broadly as you can imagine. 2 of the larger frauds combined to take in money from over 2 million people. And at the time, Albania only had around 3.5 million people total. Could you blame them? One of those firms was suddenly offering to triple your deposits in just 3 months. Why even work at that point? Or better yet, why even own anything? Every once in a while, you'll catch a story in the mainstream business news about how someone sold their house to buy Tesla or Bitcoin or whatever. And at the height of this mania, this was commonplace. There's a haunting quote about Tirana, the capital of Albania, smelling like a slaughterhouse because of all the farmers driving their cattle to the city. Those assets had been their livelihood, but why bother when you can get the cash and triple that in a few months? In November 1996, the first firm collapsed. At the time, it had been offering interest rates guaranteed to double your money every 2 months. This clarifying event sent people running for their money at other institutions, dooming them, or dooming them sooner than otherwise, because the very definition of a Ponzi has a failure baked into it. The government, after letting things get so bad, continued to make the situation worse when they tried to draw a distinction between the companies that had started out legit and those that were scams from the start. Of course, this was due in part to significant political contributions to their leadership that had been made by those businesses. It always is. It didn't matter what they were, though, since what they had become was the same as all the others. One tried to prove it wasn't a Ponzi and attract deposits by lowering its interest rates, almost in a reverse psychology, but it was far too late. Everything collapsed. 2/3 of the population had invested in the schemes, with losses totaling more than $1 billion. That was about half of the country's total GDP for 1996. There were some who believed that the government might bail people out, take care of people like it might have done under the communist regime, but this time was different. If you lost everything, you had nothing. If you had sold your home and your cattle, all you earned was a lesson. Rioting was widespread. Government buildings were burned to the ground, and the state's armory was broken into so that suddenly everyone had access to high-powered weaponry. Roving gangs held up their countrymen for survival and killed if necessary. Over 2,000 people lost their lives in the aftermath. There's a common cultural belief that the Albanian's besa is worth more than gold. Unfortunately, all it takes is for a few people to decide that they'd rather have the gold to destroy a country. Today, Albania has recovered and is ascending. Since the crisis, the only year of negative GDP growth they've had was during COVID, even growing through the great financial crisis. And there's a chance that by the end of the decade, Albania will be officially joining the European Union. Thanks for watching, guys.